Hello and welcome to Codex Lee. My name is Lee and this is a channel all about books. So I just wanted to do a quick video recapping my thoughts and feelings about the first book I've read as part of the 5 Decades of Horror Challenge. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, I did a TBR video, which I'll put a link to that up there so you can see it. So this is reading a book from a horror book from each of the 5 decades, from the 1970s through to the 2010s. So I've read the first one in that sequence, which is the book from the 1970s, and this is The Fog by James Herbert. Now the first thing to say is this review will be a little spoilery. I'm not going to go into huge detail about the plot, but I will kind of talk a bit about the plot. And it is about a fog, hence the title, which sort of covers large parts of England, and anybody who comes into contact with this fog, anybody who breathes in the fog, they go completely insane, and they try and harm people or harm themselves. And this fog appears to have a bit of a life of its own, and it sort of grows over time. And our central character, who's called Holman, I think John Holman, maybe. So he comes into contact with this fog at the start. He goes insane, but then he's sort of cured, and he works with the government to try and stop this thing before it kind of turns everybody insane. I read this book because it was included as one of the 10 books in Danse Macabre by Stephen King. So in Danse Macabre, Stephen King devotes a large part of that book to discussing 10 horror novels from about 1950 to about 1980 that he considers to be 10 of the finest during that period. And The Fog is one of those. And he talks in Danse Macabre about the energy of this book, really, and he talks in particular about one sequence in that book, which takes place on Bournemouth Beach. But there is a character who she decides that she wants to take her own life. She's been in a relationship with another woman, and this other woman has broken up with her. She's devastated, so she decides she's going to take her own life. She starts walking into the sea, but then as she gets, a certain distance, she realizes actually she doesn't want to take her own life, so she starts walking back. But when she turns around, she sees hordes of people walking down the beach towards the sea, and she can't get through them. So she gets pushed back into the ocean, and no matter how much she tries to get through this sea of people, she's pushed back into the actual sea, and she ends up drowning. Even though she didn't want to take her own life, she dies anyway. It's genuinely horrific. And that moment where she turns around and sees all these people, I'd sort of forgotten that I'd read about this in Danse Macabre, so it kind of stunned me reading about that again. It is a really powerful sequence. However, the rest of the book has so many flaws. I wanted to give this book 3 stars, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it, so I give it 2 stars in the end. Why? There are a few reasons. The obvious reason is it is very badly written. And I think Stephen King, or at least I've read somewhere that somebody says that, James Herbert is not literary. He's not a literary writer, which to me is like shorthand for he's a bad writer. And he is. Like, the quality of the writing is bad. So I'd sort of read, there was like a question asked on Goodreads about James Herbert, like, do most of James Herbert's books involve lots of sex scenes? And apparently they do. There's a lot of sex in this, or there's genuine consensual sex between two people. There's sexual assault and rape and sexual violence, and there's just a heavy emphasis on sex, often quite unnecessarily so. But it's comical. Like, the writing, when he's talking about writing about sex, is comical. So the protagonist and his love interest, they've been through some pretty horrific circumstances. So at one point, she was driven insane and attacked him, and he had to fight her off, and then she was cured, and now they're together again. So they're having sex. Here are a few lines from the description of that sex. Her legs bent, but did not close around him, unwilling to restrict his movements or her own upward thrusts. One of his hands reached up for her breast and crushed it cruelly, but the cruelty was derived from passion and was understood and welcomed. That is a bad sex scene, and you sort of wonder, what is he trying to do with this? Is he trying to kind of show that there's genuine intimacy between these two people? Fine. I mean, there are many other ways of showing that other than writing, a sex scene. But the sex scene is so badly written, and it goes on. It goes on and on and on. It's kind of comical. It's weirdly comical. So, yeah. So that's kind of like the lighter side of the bad writing. It goes without saying, and I'm kind of getting tired of saying it, there's a lot of sexism in this. And here's a challenge, okay? I'm tired of talking about the sexism in horror books I've read written by male authors, particularly those that were written in the 70s and 80s. If you know of a book written by a male author, a horror book, written by a male author that is, more than a couple of decades old, that isn't sexist, please point me towards it, particularly if it's a book that portrays women in a positive light. I'd love to read that book, because I'm kind of getting tired of talking about this, and I'm going to try not to go on about it too much in talking about The Fog, but I'll just say now, it is very sexist. Anyway, in addition to being sexist, the thing that really bothered me about this is it is deeply homophobic. There is a character, so I think one of the interesting things he does is he briefly focuses on different characters because he sets them up for the moment where they come into contact with the fog, or sometimes you meet them when they kind of make vague references to have already been in the fog, so you know that they're going to go insane at some point and something terrible is going to happen. And that's kind of interesting. You get these brief vignettes of these different lives, and some of them more interesting than others. So there is a character who appears in this, and he is a school teacher. He's a deputy head at a boys' school. And he's on a school trip with some of the boys from the school, and he becomes infected by the fog, and some of the boys become infected. And you learn a little bit about his past, that he fought in the Second World War, and he had relationships with other men. So, homosexuality was illegal in England until 1967. So this is less than a decade before this book was published. And of course, homophobia was very prevalent at the time this book was written, as it is to a certain degree today, but certainly back then. And of course, there were these common myths that were perpetuated, which equated homosexuality with paedophilia. That if you know that a man is gay, you should keep him away from children, because and this book perpetuates that myth. So this deputy head who works in the boys' school, he has a bit of an enemy in somebody else who works at that school who was in the army with him and knows that he's gay, and hints to the headmaster that he needs to keep an eye on his deputy because he knows things about him. He needs to be careful with him, with the boys. And I was kind of willing to go along with it initially because I figured, well, is James Herbert just trying to portray, what homophobia looked like at this time? But no, he doesn't, because he goes a step further than that. So at one point he's writing from the perspective of the deputy, who says, so he's reflecting on his own homosexuality, and he says, mercifully, after a few years, even the desire began to fade, as though his mind had accepted the disability, not just compromised, but given in completely to the impotence of his body. So he lost an arm through an accident during the war. So that's what the disability refers to. He felt no yearning towards the young boys he taught, or attraction to the young men he came in contact with, although he still liked to be around them. So that kind of treads a fine line, but it goes further later on. So he's talking about his attitudes towards discipline in the boys. Of course, corporal punishment was pretty common in England and English schools at this time. Many a boy had been punished for leaving a discarded sock under a bed. He secretly enjoyed going through their lockers, seeking out pornographic photographs or books, various items that could be confiscated, even sniffing at dirty handkerchiefs for signs of masturbation. And then it goes a step further again when he enters the gymnasium where the boys have been exercising, and the boys have all gone insane because they've breathed in this fog, and they're all sexually molesting each other and sexually molesting a teacher. And he walks in and sees this, and he becomes aroused. And it goes from there, and there's a pretty horrific sequence that takes place from there. I can accept the idea that the effect this fog has brings out the worst in people, brings out the worst homophobia, brings out the worst violence. But it's, I guess, his treatment of the sexual violence that is really problematic, because it takes this character, a gay man in England in the mid-1970s, and strongly implies, and more or less confirms, that he is also a paedophile, which is sad. And this is quite early on in the book, so it kind of set the tone for his treatment of sexuality later on. Because when we get to the character I referred to earlier, who is a lesbian living in mid-1970s England, the way that he describes the relationship here is in stark contrast to the relationship between gay men. When it comes to gay women, he's basically like writing a sexual fantasy. He's describing the sexual encounters, the sexual intimacy between these two women in great detail, which he doesn't do with the man. The man, the gay man, it's all about him basically desiring the bodies of boys and being punished for that. Whereas the gay women, it is all about the sexual intimacy between the women, and that being portrayed as actually something, whilst being somewhat taboo, is also, it is not in any way portrayed in a negative light. So you've got this man describing homosexuality when it's between other men, it is vilified, and if it's between women, it becomes a fantasy. And then lastly, I've got to talk about Casey, who's the love interest in this. Not a very good character. None of them are good characters. So she goes insane at one point. We learn about her relationship with her father. She has a very close relationship with her father, and she effectively is possessed by her father. Her father doesn't allow her to have a relationship with other men, and she has to. And she seems quite happy to be possessed by her father, but she's also attracted to Holman, the protagonist, and is sort of torn between these two men who basically possess her. And then the relationship with the father is implied to be very, very intimate, and then James Herbert goes there towards the end. We learn that her father is not her real father, that her mother had an affair. And then when she approaches her father's bed, so he's in bed, she's insane, she approaches his bed, and it's implied that he thinks that she's come to him to go to bed with him. When she is insane and she's attacking Holman in his apartment, it's a pretty violent confrontation. I can understand that, she's gone insane, he's trying to protect himself, but Herbert adds in this bit. So she's knocked back violently, causing her to lose her grip of the knife handle. So she's holding a knife. She fell to the floor with a scream more of rage than hurt, her skirt rising high to her thighs, the sight exciting Holman despite his predicament. So he's being attacked by this woman who is trying to kill him, and nearly does. And at one point, his skirt rises and he gets turned on. Really? So she's infantilized in the relationship with the dad, also sexualized because her dad, who isn't really a dad, wants to sleep with her, and even sexualized at a point where she's trying to kill another man. So yeah, it's it's difficult to find anything that I like about this book aside from the sequence on Bournemouth Beach, which is as good as Stephen King describes, but one good sequence does not make a good book. The writing is really bad. The homophobia is offensive. The sexism is offensive. Not a great start to the 5 decades of horror, and I struggle to understand why this would be chosen by Stephen King as one of the 10 greatest horror books written between 1950 and 1980. Surely there were better books than this. And like I said, I wanted to give it 3 stars because I really enjoyed that sequence on Bournemouth Beach, and I really liked the kind of the relentless energy, I suppose, of this book, and I liked the kind of the ever-increasing chaos of it. How things fall apart very quickly and become more catastrophic. That's interesting, and I like the way that Stephen King does that with particularly some of his Richard Bachman books. So if you read Roadwork, for instance, and this man's life is kind of falling apart and becoming more and more chaotic, I like that, how things are just kind of coming out of control, and I like that with this book. But there was just so much I didn't like about it, and there was so much that I found offensive about it. So I don't think I'll be reading any other James Herbert books, I'm afraid, if this is what they're like. And I gather that this is kind of what they're like. It's just not for me. Sorry. Yeah, I am glad I read The Fog, in that I'd never read James Herbert, and actually a friend of mine at university recommended James Herbert to me years ago. And it is an interesting slice of horror for a particular audience, and I'm not that audience. So anyway, I'll be back in hopefully a few days talking about Thinner. See you soon.